June 1999. NASA engineers in Houston stare at their screens in disbelief. Critical software controlling life support systems aboard the International Space Station has vanished from their servers. His name was Jonathan Joseph James. To the world, he was C0 MRAID, a handle that would soon become infamous in hacker circles and federal courtrooms. What drives a teenager to target the Pentagon? Jonathan later said it was curiosity, not malice. He wanted to see if he could do it. The challenge. His first major target, the Defense Threat Reduction Agency, a little-known Pentagon division responsible for tracking nuclear and biological weapons threats. Jonathan found a backdoor, a flaw in the login system. The haul was staggering. Over 3,300 usernames and passwords, email intercepts, internal memos discussing weapon systems, troop deployments, and classified threat assessments. But Jonathan wasn't done. His next victim was bigger, more audacious, and would ultimately seal his fate. NASA. NASA's response was swift and brutal. They shut down their entire computer system for 3 weeks to assess the damage and plug the holes. The FBI's hunt for C0 MRAID took months. Jonathan covered his tracks well, routing his attacks through multiple servers using stolen accounts, erasing logs. But he made mistakes. He bragged in hacker chat rooms. January 2000. Federal agents knocked on the door of the James family home in Pinecrest. Jonathan was 16 now, still in high school, still living with his parents. The charges were federal and serious. Unauthorized access to a protected computer, interception of electronic communications, theft of government property. Jonathan James was just 15 years old when he first penetrated the Pentagon's defenses. Jonathan's defense was simple. He was a kid, he didn't mean any harm, he never sold the data or hurt anyone. But the Justice Department saw it differently. This wasn't a harmless prank. In September 2000, Jonathan James pled guilty. He was 16 years old. The plea deal spared him the maximum sentence, but it didn't spare him from becoming a symbol. He served his time, barely speaking to other inmates, reading technical manuals and books on computer security. Jonathan tried to rebuild. He moved out of his parents' house, found low-level IT work, stayed off the radar. But he couldn't shake the past. His probation officer monitored his internet use. For 6 years, Jonathan stayed clean. No breaches, no networks, no trouble. He worked, he kept his head down, he tried to forget the code that had once come so easily to him. Investigators zeroed in on a ring of international hackers operating out of Miami. And because Miami had a history with hackers, because Jonathan James lived there and had a record, his name surfaced. The investigation dragged on for months. Other suspects emerged, international criminals with ties to Eastern Europe, professionals who moved stolen data across borders. But Jonathan remained on the list. By 2008, Jonathan was unraveling. He'd fought so hard to stay clean, to rebuild, and now the same system that had incarcerated him at 16 was closing in again. May 18th, 2008. Jonathan James sat down at his computer and typed a final message to his family and friends. His suicide note was blunt and bitter. He wrote, quote, "I have no faith in the justice system. Perhaps my actions today and this letter will send a stronger message to the public." Software controlling ISS life support systems worth $1. 7 million forced NASA to shut down computers for 3 weeks, accessed emails and passwords of NASA employees. Within months, federal prosecutors charged 11 suspects in the TJX breach. Jonathan James was not among them. The real perpetrators were international criminals, professionals who'd been operating for years. His story didn't end with his death. What Jonathan did at 15 was illegal, yes. But was it evil? He didn't sabotage the space station. He didn't sell secrets to enemies. He looked. He explored. He proved he could get in. His day. Did the punishment fit the crime? Jonathan himself, in the few interviews he gave, insisted he never intended harm. But the government saw it differently. This wasn't harmless exploration. This was espionage, theft, a national security breach. The fact that a teenager could penetrate the Pentagon terrified officials. The investigation that led to Jonathan began in late 1999. System administrators at the Defense Threat Reduction Agency noticed something wrong. Files were being accessed at odd hours. At first, they thought it might be foreign intelligence. Russia, China, North Korea. The Defense Threat Reduction Agency deals with weapons of mass destruction, nuclear deterrence, classified military technology. The hackers' digital fingerprints pointed to an IP address in South Florida. Not Moscow, not Beijing, a residential neighborhood in Miami. Federal agents couldn't believe it at first. They traced it further. The intrusions were happening late at night, on weekends, during school holidays. The pattern suggested a young person, someone with time on their hands and no 9-to-5 job. Jonathan James was home alone when they arrived on January 26, 2000. He was 16 by then, but the hacks had started when he was 15. Jonathan didn't deny it. He admitted everything. In fact, he seemed almost proud. With just 13 lines of code, he captured 3,300 Pentagon passwords in a single day. The NASA hack was the crown jewel. He'd broken into computers at the Marshall Space Flight Center in Alabama and downloaded software used to control temperature and humidity on the space station. More damaging than the theft was the shutdown. At the Defense Threat Reduction Agency, the damage was different but just as serious. Jonathan had installed a backdoor, a hidden program that gave him ongoing access. He intercepted over 3,000 messages. Most were routine, bureaucratic. But some contained usernames and passwords for Defense Department systems, details of weapons programs, internal communications that should never have left secure channels. Prosecutors wanted to make an example of him. They charged him under federal computer crime laws, statutes designed for adult hackers, corporate spies, foreign agents. Not kids. But the law didn't care about intent. Jonathan's defense was simple. He was curious. He didn't sell anything. He didn't sabotage systems. He didn't work for a foreign power. In September 2000, Jonathan pleaded guilty. He was 16. The deal: 6 months in a federal prison, followed by probation until he turned 21. Prison was brutal. Jonathan was a skinny, introverted computer kid thrown into a federal facility with adult criminals. He was bullied, threatened, isolated. The 6 months felt like years. The terms of his probation were suffocating. No unsupervised internet access, no computers without permission, random searches of his home, regular check-ins with a probation officer. Jonathan tried to rebuild his life. He got a job, stayed out of trouble, kept his head down. The software Jonathan copied was worth $1.7 million, and NASA had to shut down completely for 3 weeks to assess the damage. In 2007, 7 years after his arrest, the past came roaring back. Federal agents appeared at his door again. This time, it wasn't about NASA or the Pentagon. Jonathan was named as a suspect. Not the mastermind, but possibly an accomplice. The evidence was thin, circumstantial at best. Other hackers had already been arrested and charged. He insisted he was innocent. He had nothing to do with TJX. He'd stayed clean, followed the rules, lived quietly. But the accusations alone were enough to destroy him. Jonathan saw what was coming. Another trial. More prison. The shadow of suspicion that would never lift, no matter how many times he proved his innocence. On May 18, 2008, Jonathan James was found dead in his home in Pinecrest, Florida. He was 25 years old. In the note, Jonathan wrote that he had no faith in the justice system, that he was innocent of the crimes federal agents were now investigating, that he refused to be a scapegoat. But what crime was he accused of? And why did a young man who had already served his time, who had turned his life around, believe the government was coming for him again? The answer begins 6 months earlier, in the summer of 2007. A massive cyber attack struck the retail giant TJ Maxx and several other major companies. Hackers had penetrated the company's payment systems and stolen credit card information on a scale never seen before. 45 million cards were compromised. The damage would eventually exceed $300 million. The FBI launched one of the largest cybercrime investigations in its history. They traced the attack to an international network of hackers operating across 3 continents. 1999 Godu. FBI begins tracking intrusions of 2000 Godu. Jonathan's home raided, arrested v. 2000 Godu. Pleads guilty, first juvenile convicted v. 2002 Godu. Released after 6 months in prison. And somehow, Jonathan James's name ended up on their list. Despite having no connection to the breach, despite living quietly in Florida working a normal job, federal agents believed he was involved. In March of 2008, the FBI raided his home. They seized his computers, his hard drives, every piece of electronic equipment he owned. They questioned him for hours. Jonathan maintained his innocence. He had been out of the hacking world for years. He had served his sentence as a juvenile. He had moved on. But the agents didn't believe him. They told him they had evidence, that other hackers in the TJ Maxx ring had named him, that he was going back to prison, this time as an adult, for decades. For Jonathan, the nightmare he thought he'd escaped was starting all over again. Only this time, he faced real prison. Federal maximum security. Friends and family say he became withdrawn in the weeks that followed. He knew what was coming. He had already lived through the media circus, the trial, the detention center. He told people close to him that he couldn't go back, that he wouldn't survive it, that the system had already destroyed him once and he refused to let it happen again. Then, on May 18th, 2008, he made his final decision. The gunshot was heard by neighbors at 6:30 in the morning. What makes Jonathan's death even more tragic is what happened next. 3 months after he died, the FBI announced the real perpetrators of the TJ Maxx hack. Hack's hack. 11 international cybercriminals were indicted. Their operation had spanned years and multiple countries. The ringleader was a man named Albert Gonzalez. Jonathan served 6 months in a federal prison, but the real punishment was 10 years of probation that followed him everywhere, a digital shadow he could never. Jonathan James was not among them. His name was never mentioned in the indictments. No charges were ever filed against him in connection with the TJ Maxx breach. He had been telling the truth all along. He was innocent, and he had died believing the government would never believe him. The FBI never publicly explained why Jonathan was investigated. They never apologized to his family. They simply moved on to the real criminals. Some who knew Jonathan believed the FBI targeted him because of his past, that his juvenile conviction made him an easy suspect, a known name in a case they didn't yet understand. Others think it was even simpler. They needed someone to pressure, someone who had cracked government systems before, someone they could flip to get information on the real hackers. But Jonathan refused to be that person. He had already paid his debt. And when faced with the prospect of becoming a federal scapegoat, he chose the only exit he saw. His death sent shockwaves through the hacker community. Here was someone who had been a legend at 15, who had embarrassed NASA and the Pentagon, and the system had destroyed him anyway. Not for what he did as a teenager, but for what he refused to do as an adult, confess to a crime he didn't commit. The story doesn't end with his release. It ends 6 years later, in 2007, when the largest retail data breach in history exploded across the news. TJX companies. Federal investigators needed someone to blame, and they remembered the kid who'd hacked the Pentagon 7 years earlier. Jonathan James was now 24, living quietly in Florida, working as a systems administrator. On the morning of January 16th, 2008, federal agents surrounded his parents' house. Secret Service, armed. They seized his computers, his phones, every piece of electronic equipment he owned. 45 million credit cards stolen, largest retail hack in U.S. history. At the time, Jonathan James had no involvement. Jonathan insisted he was innocent. He hadn't touched TJX. He'd been clean for years, but federal prosecutors didn't believe him. They offered a deal, plead guilty, 5 years in prison. He refused, because unlike his first arrest, this time he hadn't done it, and he knew what prison meant now. He'd tasted it as a child. 6 months that had shattered him. His family believed him. His friends believed him. But the system didn't care. They had his history. Juvenile conviction. NASA hacker. Pentagon intruder. In the eyes of the law, he would always be guilty. The evidence against him was circumstantial at best. No forensic link between his equipment and the TJX servers. No chat logs, no witnesses. Just the fact that he'd been a hacker once. Jonathan watched as other suspects in the case cut deals. They pointed fingers at each other. At him. Anything to reduce their own sentences. The The federal machine was grinding. On May 18th, 2008, 5 months after the raid, Jonathan James sat down at his computer in his parents' house. He typed a final message, a suicide note. Short, defiant. Quote, "I have no faith in the justice system. Perhaps my actions today and this letter will send a stronger message to the public." He wrote that he believed the federal prosecutors would take him to trial regardless of his innocence, that they would twist his past into proof of his guilt. And then he ended it, a self-inflicted gunshot. He was 25 years old. 10 years after he'd first broken into a government computer as a curious kid in his bedroom. His family released his suicide note to the press. They insisted he was innocent, that the federal government had hounded an innocent man to his grave. The FBI indicted 11 cybercriminals in the TJ Maxx case, but one of them was already dead. 2 years later, in 2010, federal prosecutors indicted the actual TJX hacker, Albert Gonzalez, a criminal mastermind who'd stolen over 170 million card numbers from multiple retailers. Gonzalez got 20 years, the sentence they'd threatened Jonathan with, for a crime Gonzalez actually committed. And Jonathan's computers seized in the raid? Clean. No trace of the TJX intrusion. The federal government never apologized, never acknowledged the mistake. Jonathan's death was filed away as the suicide of a known cybercriminal, a footnote in the TJX case. Nothing more. His story became a cautionary tale in hacker circles, not about the dangers of breaking the law, but about the impossibility of escaping your past once the system has marked you. Jonathan James was brilliant, curious, reckless as a teenager, yes, but he'd served his time. He tried to rebuild. His mother still keeps his computers, the ones the Secret Service returned after they found nothing. She says he loved technology, that he never wanted to hurt anyone, that he just wanted to explore. Today, the systems he breached are exponentially more secure. Multi-factor authentication, encrypted tunnels, intrusion detection that would have caught him in seconds. But the human cost of that security? Still measured in destroyed lives. Jonathan's gravestone sits in a quiet Florida cemetery. No mention of NASA, no mention of the Pentagon, just his name, his dates, and a life that ended far too soon. He was the first juvenile ever incarcerated for hacking in the United States, and his death stands as a reminder that when a 15-year-old kid can walk into NASA, the failure isn't his. The boy who hacked the Pentagon never lived to see 30, but his story lives on. A ghost in the machine, a warning etched in code, that curiosity without compassion, security without mercy.